The world before equal rights was a far stretch from where we are today. Look around now at the diversity that stands, and then compare it to what it was in the 1960s. Every aspect of the African American's life was separated. Every water fountain, bathroom, store, restaurant, church, all high schools, and other school facilities. Every bit of their life was apart from the whites that walked the streets in triumph. White children grew up in the mindset that they are more superior than the African Americans. They preached every discriminatory word they heard and spread this belief as publicly as possible. The racist hate that African Americans felt was what sparked activists to finally take a stand. One part that sparked ignition into the activists for the civil rights movement was the Brown v. Board of Education trial. This case brought to the Supreme Court's attention the unequal education of blacks and whites. It began with the Brown family. The daughters all had to overcome extreme difficulties and obstacles to get to their all-black school many miles away, even though there was a closer white school to them. The family eventually filed to the federal district court because the family believed the school system was violating the 14th Amendment. In the end, with the support of the NAACP, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which unanimously voted state laws requiring separate but equal schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
I was in law school, and that was obviously a key legal decision in the United States, which was handled by, who was it? It was the Supreme Court Justice.
Is it Warren? Or,
well, the lawyer, the African-American lawyer who handled it was Marshall, Thurgood Marshall, and and he was later appointed to the Supreme Court by Lyndon Johnson. But that's a very, very important case and landmark case, which I think unfortunately it didn't completely resolve the problem of segregation of schools in the United States.
Brown v. Board of Education trial may have been an important case from a legal standpoint because it achieved integration of high schools. However, it merely skimmed the surface for achieving what the civil rights movement really wanted. It couldn't change the people's beliefs on African Americans yet. What did come out of the Brown v. Board of Education trial was a rise for activists to keep on wanting change and results from the people.
What about you, sir? Do you think the colored students will show up?
If I got anything to do with it, they won't show up. Well, I think it's a breaking point of the school integration. I just don't feel that they have a right to go to school.
The people who were held accountable to lead this change were Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and John Lewis. There were thousands of others that joined part in the civil rights movement as well, but these were just a few of the infamous people. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X represented the two sides of the movement that were not completely in favor of one another. Malcolm X believed strongly in black nationalism, which meant blacks and whites should be separated because the mistreatment is misfit for anyone to endure. Martin Luther King was more into practicing civil disobedience and showing defiance by proving and showing the ugly side of white Americans. Both men had large followings,
Reverend Martin Luther
but they didn't
King,
necessarily
so that Reverend
agree
Martin
with
Luther
one
King
another.
can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless. That's what you mean by nonviolent. Be defenseless. Be defenseless in the face of one of the most cruel beasts that has ever taken the people into captivity. That's this American white man. And they have proved it throughout the country by the police dogs and the police clubs. 100 years ago, they used to put on a white sheet and use a bloodhound against Negroes. Today, they have taken off the white sheet and put on police uniforms. They've traded in the bloodhounds for police dogs, and they're still doing the same thing. And just as Uncle Tom, back during slavery, used to keep the Negroes from resisting the bloodhound or resisting the Ku Klux Klan by teaching them to love their enemy or pray for those who use them despitefully. Today, Martin Luther King is just a 20th century or modern Uncle Tom or a religious Uncle Tom who is doing the same thing today to keep Negroes defenseless in the face of attack that Uncle Tom did on the plantation to keep those Negroes defenseless in the...
Big deal of difference between non-resistance to evil and non-violent resistance. Non-resistance leaves you in a state of stagnant passivity and bedlam complacency, wherein non-violent resistance means that you do resist in a very strong and determined manner. And I think some of the criticisms of nonviolence, or some of the critics fail to realize that we are talking about something very strong, and they confuse non-resistance with non-violence.
Malcolm X may not have believed in the civil disobedience that Martin Luther King preached, but it was still an extremely effective way to display their movement. Through the Montgomery bus boycott, they peacefully took a stand against segregation on buses. The Freedom Riders did the same on interstate buses. John Lewis was one of the most famous Freedom Riders there was. Additionally, many African Americans took part in sit-ins to show defiance against publicly segregated areas like restaurants. All these acts of civil disobedience showed the ugliness of racism and only motivated the activists to keep on moving forward.
And they sat in at the president's office, a bunch of students, and they occupied the office of the president of Duke University. And it was peaceful, and that was one where they simply occupied the office for 4 or 5 days, and just to make a point.
All these acts of civil disobedience led to the March on Washington. Thousands of African Americans joined hand in hand and marched the streets with determination in their eyes. Whites who believed in the cause marched alongside them. Over 250,000 people came to Washington that day to support equal rights for all. This day marks Martin Luther King's famous speech that caused motivation to fill the crowd and show that they were never going to back down.
I think for civil rights matters, of course, a lot of white Americans wanted to support their cause and join them. I think for other kinds of demonstrations, like the anti-nuclear plant, like the fracking and pipeline demonstrations, you see people of all nationalities and all colors.
And when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Free at last he was. On July 2, 1964, the Civil Rights Act was enacted. The discrimination based upon race, color of skin, religion, sex, or natural origin was outlawed. Everything Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, John Lewis, Malcolm X, Marshall, the Freedom Riders, everything everyone had worked for paid off. They were finally free at last. However, it was going to take a while to change people's belief, but at least now they're free and equal in a legal standpoint.
In the slow progress of getting a more fair and just society, I think it was, and I think people around the world also looked at the American Civil Rights Movement and said, hey, it's about time, America. We're with you. You know, I was inspired by the Civil Rights Movement. And in fact, one of my heroes is John Lewis, who marched with Martin Luther King and who wrote a wonderful autobiography about those years, which I recommend to any young person wanting to be inspired by the Civil Rights Movement. And he became a congressman and is still a very influential politician in Congress.